So at Summerland this year, I decided to do a workshop on deepening divination practice, because we talk a lot about divination, omens and rituals, things like that, and there's the basic, knowing what your symbol set symbols are, but we don't go a lot into detail about what to do beyond that. And so what I want to talk about, and Deb had asked me to do this specifically for this festival, was what to do to get a little bit further than the standard divinatory practice of I have this divination set and I understand all the symbols. So first what I want to ask is if you use a basic form of divination right now, runes, oracles, any of those things?
I use runes.
Capital. How many use runes? How many use Omen? Greek alphabet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
I have to buy a set that hopefully someone has made, and then...
That can be arranged. Animal oracles. So there's a fairly wide variety of divinatory lots and things out there that people can use. And what I kind of want to talk about is how we basically get in touch with those symbol sets, how we learn to work with them to start with. So we'll cover some of that basic. We'll talk a little bit about omens in both public and private ritual. We'll try and hit each, at least runes and Oem. We'll potentially talk a little bit about the Greek alphabet oracle. And then I would also mention augury and some of those other less common forms of divination. And then we'll talk a little bit as well of creating your own divination sets, both from a standard set and from learning to develop your own set of symbols that speaks to you. So there's some real common techniques for connecting to your symbol set, to learning how to understand it. Because one of the first things that most people will tell you to do is that you have to get a good feel for your set of runes or your set of Oem. There are a variety of good ways to do that. Most people start out with a store-bought set, something that they went to a pagan shop and bought, or they bought their Ralph Bloom set of runes, which comes with a nifty little book and blank rune. But when you start thinking about how you're going to use this, you understand that you have to connect with that set. You have to get a feel for it, so that when you pull something, you know kind of what it means. It's okay to look at books. It's okay to read as you read, essentially. But what you want to do is you want to get to a place where you're good enough with the symbol set that you don't have to be terribly concerned with what the surface meaning is. You can understand kind of the deeper meaning. What does it mean when I pull Wunjo? What does it mean when I pull Kenaz? How do I read these things? What are all the possible meanings and how do I pull them into my practice? The first thing that you will often see recommended is meditation. People will say, you should pull a symbol and concentrate on it really hard and meditate about it, and, read the lore around it and things like that. But what I want to suggest is an actual process for that meditation, because most books don't actually tell you what to do. They just say go meditate on your symbol. And what I like to do, especially when I'm just starting out with a new symbol set, is I get an understanding of what the symbol means. If it's an animal oracle, I look up the animal in a field guide or something like that. If it's a rune set, then I'll find out what the name is of each rune. If it's an Omen set, I'll find out a little something about the tree. If it's the Greek set, then I'll read the poem that comes with it. Is it a poem? It's not a poem, actually. It's a set of lines, I guess. But there's a technique in the ADF Dedicate program about finding your silence. And the process of doing that is so that you can get to a point in your meditation so that there's not any distraction for you. And at that point in your meditation, so this assumes some pre-knowledge of meditation, at that point where you've reached that silence, that place where there are no other thoughts that are kind of imposing themselves on you, start to allow associations to form with that word. So if you're thinking about Fehu, for instance, the rune that means cow in Old Norse, think about the associations that you have with cows. What does it mean to you? What do the ancients mean when they said cattle? In this case, they meant movable wealth. There's also gold mentioned in some of the rune poems. So you can kind of start to understand what it means to both yourself and to the ancients, just by kind of doing that internal free association. And when you do that kind of internal free association, as soon as you are done meditating, it's time to journal. Come back to journaling every so often, but make sure that you're spending time writing down what it is that you thought about when you went through the process of doing this meditation. It does you no good to meditate on a symbol and not write anything down. You'll retain a fraction of what it is that you wanted to learn. The symbol a day approach is very common as well. Every morning you can reach into a bag and pull out a symbol and read it and find out what it means, read the rune poem around it, do a brief meditation so you've got something regular. This is actually probably one of the more popular ways to learn a symbol set. It's very effective doing daily divination. So if you're looking for essentially a ritual kind of thing that you can do that's a little bit more intensive than meditation, pull that symbol and again, write it down, journal it. Because if you journal it and you write it down, you can go back to it at the end of the day. You don't have to try and remember what it is that you pulled. And the really nifty thing to do with an Omen a day sort of thing is they sell things called 5-year journals. And they've got 5 or 6 lines for every day for 5 years on each page. So page 1 is January 1st, 1998, 1999, and so you just write down what your omens were. And as you go through the year, then you can start to look at cycles. And you're not just then getting, weekly cycles or monthly cycles, you start then to get year-long cycles. And what is it that I was doing last year that I want to do this year? How do these things relate over time? And that's one of the main reasons that journaling is important, is because as you do this work, your opinions and your thoughts will change over time. And those connections are often very difficult to see unless you've had something written down. Yes?
One thing that's also helpful sometimes with things like runes when you're learning is when you're doing your journaling or your meditation, is to just sort of like zone out and just draw.
Yeah.
And keep drawing, and whatever comes, just let it come on the paper, whatever the heck it is. That you might be the symbol over and over again, or it might, in my case, it's moved, but that's okay.
Yeah, and that actually
because
is,
it gives you more meaning.
Yeah, and that's an interesting idea as well, is the idea of that repetition of the symbol. In this case, through art, which is a very interesting angle on the idea of mantra, actually. Repeating the name of the rune is an interesting way to learn it as well. Thorrson has some interesting pronunciations for the runes. They'll describe how to vibrate the name of the rune.
Rune
Yep, Rune Valden. Seamus is in the back behind the camera doing the YMCA version of of runic studies, where you stand in one of the positions of the runes, which is also a fairly useful way of doing it. And then, of course, one of the key things to do, and this is what I always recommend, usually first, but I wanted to cover the other common initial descriptions first, because the symbol a day and the meditation is what everyone really recommends in their book on runes or their book on Omen or wherever you're learning it. But reading lore is one of the primary things that you should do. You have to learn to sort of immerse yourself in it. With the runes, we have rune poems. There are a variety of them for there's an Anglo-Saxon Rune Poem, there's an Icelandic Rune Poem, a Norwegian Rune Poem, and a couple of other minor poems that you'll find in other places as well. The Norse ABCs is one of my favorites. But as you read the poems, one of the nifty things to try and do is to learn how to memorize them. Because memorization of lore allows you to internalize that lore. And when you start to internalize it, when you pull a rune, you'll have something to say every time you pull one. So, for instance, you might pull Fehu, again, which is cattle, but there's a line in the rune poem that says, in one of the rune poems, I forget which one, I think it's the Icelandic, that says, the wolf grows up in the woods. And what that's a reference to is the idea that we must be generous with our wealth. Because to hoard the wealth is to use it improperly. And when you use wealth improperly, always bad things happen. And so when I pull the Fehu, and if that's the line that comes to mind, what I know to read in Fehu is not, oh, wealth, everything is good. It's wealth. It's a warning. You need to share that wealth. You have something that you can give to others. It's a rune very much, in that case, of the idea of hospitality and generosity. So, spend time learning the meanings and learning the rune poems if you're doing runes, learning the trees if you're doing the Omens. The interesting thing about Omens is that the tree that they're associated with is associated with that tree because it starts with that letter in Irish. And so you can also associate them with various birds, for instance, or stones, or really whatever you would like to. We call it a tree alphabet a lot of times as kind of a shorthand, but what the Irish alphabet really is just is the first letter in a bunch of different names, so all of your associations will start with that letter. So learn all of those things that are associated with it. And when you start doing that, you'll get a deeper understanding of what that Omen few means as well. A lot of this is really a process of internalizing. Because as you internalize these things, you memorize them, they'll become part of your regular ritual descriptions, right? Your regular ritual invocations and statements about these elements. So the more language you have in that storehouse, the more you'll be able to bring out and sort of push forward out into the cosmos as you pull these runes or pull an Omen. So those are kind of the really basic ways to get to know your meditation tool. That's about the point where most books and most suggestions seem to end. There are places to go beyond that, and that's really what I want to focus on in this workshop. The idea of going a step beyond what's in the books and deepening those common techniques, finding something that really kind of helps to make these symbols resonate. Kind of playing on the idea of doing a meditation for each rune is the idea of doing guided meditations for others. And this might just be the process of writing out a meditation. If you're solitary, you don't have anyone to speak a meditation to or lead on a meditation, just writing them out will essentially cover the same sort of ground, though you can always record them and play them back to yourself as well. But the process of creating a guided meditation will force you to think about what it is that really resonates for you, especially if you're very descriptive. If you want to talk about Fehu and the cattle, then how you speak about the cattle will inform you a lot about how you actually view this rune. If you focus on that wolf that grows up in the woods, then you're going to find yourself focusing quite a bit on this notion of generosity and things like that. Your symbols around this will all correlate to that. If, however, you decide to focus on the movable wealth aspect, the idea that this is transient wealth, that it is something that you happen to have received for your hard work, then your imagery is going to focus on that. And it's also possible that your imagery might entirely focus on the fact that it's a cow. It might be brown and spotted. That's okay. All of this is good information for you. All of this is important to know for the way that you deal and interact with this rune. Going off on the symbol of the day, I would also recommend doing a full ritual each day. If you really want to get to know a rune set, or you really want to get to know an Omen set, the best thing to do is to do a full ritual. Make offerings, say prayers, and at the end of it, pull a full Omen. Because the more information that you get, and the deeper that divination practice looks, the better off you're going to be in terms of getting as much information as you can. You might also look at doing both a ritual in the morning and in the evening. It's nice to not only try and see what your day will hold, but to reflect on what your day did hold. So, even if you're only pulling one rune in the morning, try pulling one in the evening as well. See how they might correlate, how they might interact. And from there, you can start to learn not only what each rune means, but what each rune means in reference to others as well. And especially when you're pulling more than one rune, as we did last night, knowing the full context of that reading is very important. It'll really color the way that you read other runes. Kenaz, for instance, is a rune that means both torch and ulcer. The torch is the bright light in the hall. The ulcer is the pain. They're two sides of the same coin. They're both related to fire. But how do you read it? You have these two very opposite meanings. One that is joy and one that is pain. If you're not careful, you're going to always read in one way. But if you understand how other runes interact, and you do a complete reading, and you pull Hagalaz, and now this, and Kenaz, you might read that not as torch, but as ulcer. If you pull Jera and Wunjo and Kenaz, then you might be looking at the torch in the hall. So it's important to understand those contexts, and the best way to do that, the best way to start doing that, is not just to do that one rune a day, but either to do that full rune spread in the middle of a ritual, or to do a rune in the morning and a rune in the evening, so that you've got something to compare it. Something else that was very interesting to me, and I did this just recently. I mentioned that there are rune poems out there. There's the Anglo-Saxon, the Norse, or the Icelandic and the Norwegian. But there is no actual rune poem for the Elder Futhark runes. So I sat down and I wrote one. And in doing so, you start to pull in the information that you have. All this lore that you've been reading, all the other poems that you've read, you start to pull in little things that mean something to you. And the process of creating a rune poem really starts to bring out the ideas that speak most to you. And since we don't have any rune poems or poems, as far as I know, for the Omen, you're pretty well starting from scratch there, which is even better. You can look at the words, all those associations, and you can bring them together. I would also recommend looking at things like the Battle of the Trees for some inspiration. It's a poem translated by several people over time, and worth reading. So do go ahead, do write one, and don't be terribly concerned about the fact that it's not an ancient rune poem. It is your rune poem at that point, and that makes it authentic and valid to you. Just don't publish it as an ancient rune poem, please. 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 What's that?
I said just sign your name, Douglas Monroe.
Yes, well, that'll work too. One of the other interesting things that I highly recommend is watching others pull runes. The understanding in the ancient world was that becoming proficient with runes or with any set of lots or any set of divination was kind of a combination of three things. It's observation, experience, and belief. And you get the experience, you can get that on your own. You know, you can pull runes all day and start to learn how they work together. Belief is something that you have to have. We have to make the assumption that this stuff works, otherwise why are we doing it? But that's a component that only you can really find for yourself. The observation piece, the idea that you can sit down and actually learn how to read by watching others, is an important thing to realize. Good seers will pull a lot of information in, and they'll have their own process for pulling an omen, or for viewing a space for augury. It's important to see how other people do it, so that when you go to do it, what you're doing not only makes sense to others, but makes sense to you. It's a way of deepening your practice, mostly by watching others do it. And it's a very valuable tool. Very, very valuable. So, observation, belief, and experience are those three keys. I do highly recommend doing it. A note on belief as well. There's a Stoic argument that I really like for this. The Stoics believe that divination proves divinity, and that divinity proves divination. Because if there are gods out there, and they like us and they want to give us blessing, then they must have some way to communicate with us, a method that works. Howling is one of them.
So is that gods out there or dogs out there?
One way, the other way, it's all the same. But yeah, so divination must work because the gods will want to speak to us. They would provide us with these methods to reach them and to work with them. So divinity proves divination, and divination in turn proves divinity because this stuff works. Anyone who's had any lengthy experience with divination will tell you very clearly that they learn things about themselves through divination. They learn things about the world around them through divination. Whether or not they're actually communicating with a higher power or not, it benefits them in some way. And because of this, and because of the fact that divination benefits everyone, there is no one that divination doesn't benefit, at least according to the argument. What you find is that if this thing is here, it must be here for a reason. And thus, divination proves that we have benevolent deities out there who want us to have this process. So that's the Stoic argument for it. I kind of like it. It's a nifty one. It's very circular, but it works well. So, any questions on any of that before we move on to the next portion here? All right. So what I want to talk about next is expanding your tool set. Divination doesn't have to just be a set of lots. It doesn't have to just be what's available to you on a bunch of cards. There are other things, ancient things even, that we have available to us that we can use to sort of deepen that divination practice. And one of the things that we've got, and this is for Omen, is what's called a Finn's window. And a Finn's window appears in the Book of Omen, among many other types of Omen. And what it is it's this set of concentric circles, and across it are all these little hash marks. If you've ever seen an Omen set, you realize that that is how Omen are built and set up. And here in the center is a nice hole. It's called a Finn's window, or a Fishfin, because presumably one can look through it. Now this is drawn on a piece of paper. We don't know that the center was punched out, if any of these were actually ever created in the ancient world. But Seamus and I had received a special order from one of our grove mates to make one of these things. And like, oh, we'll put a little hole in the middle of it, we'll see what happens. So we put it together, we thought it was pretty, and we sort of, we gave one to Sean, and we kind of forgot about it for a little bit, but we made them also in a smaller size, and I took one of them home with me. They look real nice. And when you look at a Finn's window, what it kind of represents, the words Fishfin also translate to the word Finn's ridgepole. And so if you think about an Iron Age house, how they're round and they have rafters that go up to the center, and they've got that smoke hole there in the center. You can look at this and you can see how the Ogham sort of go up in straight lines, kind of like the ridgepoles to a house. And Erin Laurie has mentioned in one of her books that you'll see the four feta around the edge, and there are 5 four feta because there's 5 of each symbol. And so 2 of them end up in one of the quadrants, and that happens to be the southeast quadrant, which is where the door to the house often was. So you can think about those as the doorposts, perhaps. And so I'm going to pass this around so people can take a look at it. But when you're lying on your back in an Iron Age house and you look up, what you can see is through the center hole and down at the mead hall here, you can actually kind of see this. It's not round, it's square, but there is that central smoke hole. And when the fire is low, it's late at night, and you're getting ready to fall asleep, what can you see through the top of that hole? You can see the cosmos spinning there above your head. And so what this might be we don't really know. There's not a whole lot of detail in the Book of Omen. There's really just the design. What this might be is the idea that through this divinatory portal, this divination that we do, we're able to see out into the cosmos, the way that things interrelate. Much like the stars turn around the pole star, so does the world revolve around the cosmos that is ordered in the way that we know it to be ordered. And so, what we've started to do, and I did this very much on accident, I stumbled onto this, but within ADF, our priests have a monthly trance journey that we do. And without too much detail, we all gather together in one place. And at that place is a central fire. And it's a place where we honor the ancestors, the ancient wise, those druids and magicians and seers who went before us. And so I said, maybe I'll do the trance journey with this thing up to my eye. You know, it's a window, I'll look through it. And so I sat down in front of my little candle and held the window up to my eye, and I looked through it, and I closed my eyes, and I went into the trance. And all through the journey to the fire, I held this thing up to my eye. And when I got there, I sat there for a little while around the fire. And the thing that was interesting to me was that typically I do not see this, but as I said, this is ancestor work that we were doing at the time. What I saw in the flames, in my vision, in my trance, was that within the flames there was this sort of ancestral skull. And I was looking at it, I was feeding the fire, and I was interacting with it. And something told me that I should open my eye, just the one that had the Finn's window open. And so I opened my eye. And right before me, of course, was the flame of the candle. And within the flame, the wick had it had melted and turned in on itself, and from where I was sitting, what I saw in the flame was a skull made from the wick. It had bubbled on one side and on the other. It was a very interesting experience, one that I certainly did not expect. And it helped me to get a little bit more connected, really, with the Omen and with the vision that I had been engaged in. The dog does like it.
He's posing for the wheel.
I think he thinks it's a doggy chew.
Right. But after this experience, we thought about it a little bit more, and I explained it to Seamus what weird thing I had done, and Seamus said, "Hey, that's cool. How do we expand that into other divination systems?" And I said, "Well, let's think about that." And so we sat down, and based on this Fege, we decided to create one for runes as well. And so we built a tool which we called Odin's Eye. And what it is very similar. It's concentric circles with the entire Elder Futhark around it. And in the center is a vault nut. And the center of the vault nut is punched out. So you've got a little triangular space that you can look through. And with the Odin's Eye, when I look at it, what I see, if you're not familiar with the myth of Odin and how he gives up his eye for wisdom in the well of memory, he places his eye in the well of memory so that he can have a drink from Ymir as well. And that is the eye that we're representing with this piece. And you can look at it in two ways with the concentric circles. There's the notion that it is the eye that you're looking at, gazing out. But there's also the idea of the ripples in the well from where the eye was placed in it. And so you can look at it in both ways, and gazing through it has a very similar experience to looking through the Fege. So if you're interested in adding to your tools, these are two fairly decent tools to do that with. Like I said, we don't know exactly how they were used in the ancient world, but through trial and error, sometimes we figure out nifty things. They can also be used for pendulum boards and things like that. Who knows what they're originally used for? But they're terribly interesting to look at. So
It's interesting that there's actually kind of a connection between Finn and Odin as well as far as their stories.
yeah.
Finn and the Salmon of Wisdom,
Yep.
and the well also.
And the one-eyed curse that he casts on the Fomorians in the Second Battle of Mag Tuireadh.
And actually, the salmon most times is described as being one-eyed itself.
Oh, is it? I actually wasn't aware of that.
So there's kind of
I think there's also, from the standpoint of stargazing through them,
yeah.
I think there's a lot to be learned, especially if you have a fixed point. If you go to your deck or in your backyard once a month and you look through that and you begin to look at how the stars change and what changes, it really does change a lot of perspective on divination and your place in the world and in the cosmos.
It will help you with using other methods like augury.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things about augury is that in order for augury to be truly successful, you have to sort of demarcate an area. So you have to define an area within which something will happen. Otherwise, everything's a sign and you can't make any sense of it. You have to narrow your focus a little bit. And this might be a good way to do that, is to look through the window or the eye and to see.
There's actually a form of divination, I think it's in Scotland, that they use where they look out a window, they turn a window, and then they wait for the first thing that goes across. If it's a red cow that walks across, it means something. If it's a white bird that flies through, so they do the same thing with stones with holes in them.
Yep.
They'll hold them up and use them as like a frame, like you're talking about.
Yep. And the Romans used to indicate this field is what I'm going to watch. So if something happens outside the field, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But once it crosses into it, suddenly you've got something that is important. So.
Well, I know at Shining Lakes when we did the spring hunt and the fall hunt, we used augury to determine which way to go. And it was either Fox or me who was determining which way to go. And some of the other people were ready to kill us, depending on where we ended up. But we ended up in some really cool places, and later they thanked us, because we led them through the prickers and this and that and the other.
Either trust us here or don't go on the hunt.
Exactly.
Appropriate clothing. And that's an important point too. And I don't remember if I actually cover this or not in the workshop, but what the seer says in rituals, well, it goes. You can always look at it later and discuss it and interpret it and talk about it. What the seer says in ritual is correct, and that's all there is to it. Even if the seer reads it wrong, the seer is still correct. It's not uncommon for a seer to mix up, for instance, Fehu and Onsus. And the way that we've always dealt with that in Three Cranes is if the seer reads something wrong, then we use that incorrect interpretation and we look at what the lore says, and then we go back to the seer. We say, hey, how does this all fit? How does it affect the vision that you had? How does it change the way that you look at these things? So, again, second guessing your seer is usually not a helpful thing.
I wouldn't even use the word wrong. I would use the seer sees what needs to be seen, regardless of what symbol it is. That's what they saw.
Yeah, it's seeing, it's not interpreting.
Right.
So, yes, the symbol is a tool.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, do you know in Irish, that there's 3 forms of divination in Irish? It seems like one of them is looking through like a tool with your hand or something. I wondered if that might tie in with this
might.
too.
I mean, you can draw them around your hand too. So, I don't know. That's a piece of lore I don't know.
Well, there's an idea. Tattoo.
That's what I was thinking, that'd be awesome, that henna or a tattoo.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Runes brothers.
Of course, that makes masturbation.
Did you say that out loud?
On tape. One of the other things that I wanted to mention, again, expanding your tools. The idea of the crane bag. For those who know the myth of the crane bag, you know that Monanon had this bag made out of the skin of a crane, and in it he kept many treasures. And a number of those treasures are often interpreted to be, and I believe the poem actually might even say that they are the forfetta of the Omen. So those are the end letters that some people use and some people don't. But within the bag, it was the treasures were visible at low tide and invisible at high tide, or vice versa, depending on the translation I've seen. So you can create a crane bag for all of your divination stuff, and you can keep it there, and consecrate that crane bag, make it special for your ritual work. The ADF Order of the Crane has a little ritual for that. And in doing so, you'll find that by making that bag special, by making the ritual work a part of what it is that you're building, the runes or the Omen or whatever the symbols that are on the cards will have a little bit more meaning there as well. Another interesting item, if you are into the Greek alphabet oracle, and Jan, if you've seen or met Jan, she has a set of these that she hasn't had a chance to use yet. She just showed them to me the other day. But the Greek alphabet oracle had a couple of different options for how you could figure out which symbol you're getting. One of them was, of course, to draw them out of a bag of alphabet tiles, your basic Scrabble tiles in Greek. Or you could roll dice, or you could roll the knuckle bones of sheep. And sheep farmers have all looked at me really funny when I say sheep knuckle bones. My sheep anatomy is not that great. However, this is what they're called in the sources. This is what they're called in modern scholastic sources, is sheep knuckle bones. And they apparently exist because Jan has castings of them. But they've got a variety of different sides, and some sides are more likely to pop up than others. And what the Greek alphabet oracle does is it pulls or it provides a list of what letter is associated with what knuckle bone. There's 24 Greek letters? Yes. So, same thing as there are with runes. You could actually adapt this to runes and use the same mathematical formula. But it changes the likelihood of pulling certain Greek oracle letters as well. It affects the mathematical probabilities.
We have a long extended discussion about the mathematical probabilities that use different-sided dice.
Yes, we did once have a very long mathematical discussion on our email list about using various dice, because apparently a 24-sided die is not a perfect polyhedron, and so yeah, you shouldn't use that because it will throw things off. So I think what we ended up with was a 12-sided die with a coin. So you roll your 12-sided die, you flip a coin, and then Yeah, heads is 1 through 12 and tails is
13 through 20.
yeah, 13 through 24. So, but adding that additional piece to it, sort of removing the symbols themselves from the process of symbol set divination is always an interesting concept, and one that may challenge you in new ways, or it might end up appealing to you as the best way to do it for you. Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by using the bones, so I keep finding bones in my backyard. So I've been collecting them, and eventually I'm going to make the full set. I don't know what the bones are of,
That's why
but I don't care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as they mean something to me.
One of the things with lots and with dice that is very important, I think, to stress is that lots and dice are really nice. Unlike augury, unlike divination by lightning bolt, there's always a way to check. They can be considered, generally speaking, objective forms of divination. When you roll a die, it tells you what you're getting. There are always interpretations to be had, and there are ways of looking at things, but it is essentially a very objective form of divination to pull lots. And it can be frightening as well. I've known people to flip coins to find out if their offerings have been accepted. It's not terribly uncommon in some groves to do that, actually. Kai is apparently a proponent of that. On the one hand, it terrifies me just a little bit to ask that question and flip a coin. He actually flips 3, so you get, best 2 out of 3, essentially. Which is one way of mitigating that, I suppose, but it's still essentially 50-50. But honestly, if you've done everything right, you'll be okay, regardless of what the Omen set is. So, one of the kinds of divination that I haven't talked a lot about is the oracle style of divination that you find in Greek Magical Druid, which is, they've got a Homeric oracle in there. And what you do is you take 3 dice, 3 6-sided dice, and you roll them. And depending on how they end up, you read that set of dice to mean a particular line from the Iliad. And that line from the Iliad, which could be extremely helpful or extremely unhelpful, depending on which line it is, it becomes your omen. It's essentially a form of bibliomancy without the Bible.
Is it the I Ching, the Chinese version?
Yes, very similar to the I Ching. But different from the I Ching, which is just kind of essentially a set of short sayings that don't have a larger context. They've got additional descriptions that have been added in, much like runes, in which case you pull Fehu, oh, that means cow, wealth, and generosity. With the I Ching, you've got kind of the same thing. But with the Iliad and this Homeric oracle, what you end up with is a whole body of literature that you can learn and memorize, and you get context on these things. And the context is really very important. Because what you find out, what you learn, is that, the saying, Achilles threw a spear through Apollo's golden house, or something like that. What the heck does that mean? But if you have read the Iliad, especially if you have memorized the Iliad, what you will find is a far deeper understanding of what's going on in that omen. And I discovered this as well, quite by accident, when I created the Jimmy Buffett Oracle. which was based on the same basic premise, where I took things that seemed oracle-y, if that's a word. I took oracle-y things,
It is now.
and I essentially sort of shoved them into a randomizer and put it up on my webpage. So you can go there and click on it and you'll get your Jimmy Buffett Oracle for the day. It started with someone saying, we need an oracle that says, get drunk and screw. And I said, okay, so we made it. But what I learned is that, and a lot of people started using it, actually, to my surprise, and some people still do. But they go to it every day, and they run the randomizer and come up with their daily Buffett saying. It was interesting to watch them interpret it, and then to understand what my interpretation of that was, because while most of them don't know more Jimmy Buffett songs than the 3 that that most people know, 2 in some cases. People who know a lot of these songs, like I do, I know them all by heart, will have a different understanding of what that means. And so, over time, what I learned is that context is incredibly important. Whether it is cultural context, so understanding the lore that surrounds it, knowing those rune poems, or whether it's just literary context, knowing where that phrase came from is very important. And this became even more apparent when Lise sent me a bunch of various sayings from Rush albums, and we created the Rush Oracle. Yes, there's a new album. I've updated the Jimmy Buffett album. Now that there's a
I found my file, so you can just send it back to me.
okay. So the Rush Oracle, which means a whole lot more to Lise than it does to me, because she's got a deeper internalization, really, of Rush lyrics than I do. I have no internalization of Rush lyrics. I just host them. But I think that's actually a very important thing, is to learn the context and to start to understand what it is that's going on.
I think from that standpoint also, not only do you know the song and the rest of the lyrics of the song, which gives a deeper meaning, but in many cases for these particular items, you know the writer of the song, what the writer was going through, how it relates to the rest of the album, and it's a much broader context and much richer because you know the writing style of Jimmy Buffett and how that relates to his entire volume of work, which goes back to what you were saying earlier about learning and deeper understanding and how it all fits.
Yeah, and there is, as you mentioned, more to it than just lyrics. For instance, the phrase "panic in the gray room now." There's all sorts of lyrical stuff around that. The lyrics are about a guy who's standing in the shower and his wife calls and his girlfriend picks up. And so he panics at it. But the song itself is actually dedicated to Muhammad Ali and his fights. So there's that additional piece of the dedication, and there's knowing what I know about Jimmy Buffett and all these things.
Sure.
So,
if you're really nerd, you might know the time signature of the song and how that relates, what key is, whether it's a major or minor.
I'm not nearly that nerdy, thankfully.
I was speaking of Lisa.
Yeah, well, Lisa would. You're right.
In a good way.
If you've got an animal oracle, obviously there's not a lot of context necessarily that you can pick up. But what you can do is you can go to the zoo. Going to the zoo is a great thing to do if you do animal oracle stuff, because you can see all of these animals in a pseudo-natural habitat, wandering around and interacting with other animals. And this is a really useful thing when you're doing the Druid Animal Oracle or something like that. It's the same thing kind of with the Plant Oracle. If you can find these things out in nature and actually look at them, the Plant Oracle will make so much more sense.
Recently this summer, I have one of the oracles I have is animal messages. And this summer I got to go hand feed hummingbirds and pet stingrays at the zoo. We went to a state park to feed the hummingbirds. And so I have a whole new understanding and deeper meaning for when I pull that hummingbird card. I'm going to have a personal experience of holding this little floral tube of sugar water right here in front of my face and having the hummingbird come right there in front of me.
Yeah.
And being able to pet the stingrays and see what kind of behaviors they had. And I was mobbed almost the entire time I was standing. Really, yeah. So, yeah, you have all of the senses involved in your understanding of that now, and that makes it exponentially more important to you to bring that experience to your reading, whether it's for yourself or somebody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And getting that personal contact, especially if you're doing an animal oracle, you're not going to learn anything from the cards. They're beautiful. They will provide you with all sorts of context clues. But unless you've actually seen a cat, you're not going to understand what the cat card means. So get to know them, get to understand them in that way. One of the things that I did, I've created divination things before, obviously the Jimmy Buffett Oracle, but the first simple set that I really created was the crane divination set, because we are 3 cranes currently, and I do all sorts of things with cranes, and so I decided, well, there's a lot of different kinds of cranes out there. I'll bet you we can find something to describe what's going on in any sort of part of life just by putting together a whole bunch of crane cards and seeing what happens. And so I spent some time kind of putting them together and seeing what happened. And I'll get into how I did that and what it means to create a symbol set in a minute, but finding a symbol that really has meaning and resonance for you and building that symbol set off of it is very important. It can give you a whole new understanding of that thing that you thought you had a really good understanding of. So spend some time kind of developing those symbols and see how they are. Any other comments for sort of getting to know your symbol set, or any other questions on that?
I think also being a druid, one of the things that I'm interested in with casting lots, going back to actually casting lots, is the idea of having a cloth or a leather piece that you can actually lay out and cast lots. And one of the things that I've played with is the 3 realms of sea, sky, and land, or the 3 kindred ancestors, shining ones, and casting those lots, see where they land and how you interpret them with those different filters on and how they work together. I think that it broadens that lay of the divinational tool.
In my own practice, I do something similar out of casting cloth that I made the ordering of the Magnates of Tara, where they talk about the directions symbolizing, battle in the north, prosperity in the east, music in the south, wisdom in the west, and then sovereignty in the center.
Yeah.
And I set it up, and when I do the cast, where it lands, you can draw further inferences by, you not only have the meaning of the poem itself, you also have where it landed and how that affects it.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
It really helped.
Developing a casting set or a casting board or something like that on your own is very important, I think, because then you're understanding how they interact to start with. If I lay this at the hill of Tara, what does it mean in each of these realms around it? So these are very useful things.
And
Yeah.
It's not hard, you don't have to be able to sew, you can work it out on a piece of paper with pencil, and then just use magic marker to draw on the cloth.
Oh, absolutely.
Basically what I did.
Yeah.
Just took a circle,
Yeah.
drew it, another circle inside of it, and then divided it into 4.
Yeah, so don't make it hard on yourself.
So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is the last major topic, is creating your own symbol set. Because like I said, it's kind of cool to do. But I'm going to talk specifically about lots or sortilege here, so the idea of casting something like runes or Omen or a symbol like the crane set that we've got. But always start with what you know. If you know trees, do trees. If you know animals, do animals. Pick the ones that speak to you. And the really nifty thing that's going to happen is that you're going to develop something that really has deep meaning for you personally. It might be a little bit different than someone else, but you're always going to want to think about what another person might have associations with that thing. So, you know, my associations, for instance, with wolves, very Indo-European. They're not positive things typically. Or dragons, even better. That's a far better example. Dragons are bad in the Indo-European world. They are hoarders of wealth. They take things away and they keep them away. There are no redeeming qualities for these giant serpents in the Indo-European world. But in the modern world, we have a very different opinion. Mostly, you know, informed by Chinese lore, by modern science fiction and fantasy. We think about them very differently today than the Indo-Europeans did, where they were just these serpents that stole stuff and kept it. They weren't generous, which made them bad. And so when I think about dragons, that's what I think about, the beings that hoard the waters and keep them from the folk, that are wise, but they keep that wisdom to themselves. They don't disseminate it. They sit upon their hoard so that wealth can't get back out to the folk. All the things that bad people do. But if I'm going to create a symbol set that includes a dragon, I have to recognize the modern influence as well. Because someone else is going to look at this and they're going to say, oh, dragons are good. They're all about, you know, knowledge and wisdom and finding your inner power, and they're about the earth and chthonic things, and this is all good. So we're all going to have slightly different interpretations and slightly different thoughts. So when you're thinking about a symbol set and creating one that someone else might use, then you'll definitely want to consider other opinions than your own. But always sit down and always start with kind of a brainstorming session. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to others? What is it that, you know, really sort of moves you? What are the meanings that this has for you? And, you know, rough out, you know, 25 or 30 different symbols if you can. That's a good number. Runes have 24, Omen have 25. In that area, you're generally okay. If you're looking for something really complex, which I don't recommend for your first attempt at this, you can always try tarot cards with 78. 78 or 72? 78. Yeah.
78,
Yeah.
but you could do a major arcana, which is only 22.
That's true, you can. So, but think about what those associations are, and kind of just sort of write them down. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take that list of 30 or 25 or however many as you have, and you're going to apply to it what I call the Magic 8-Ball ratio. The reason the Magic 8-Ball is so popular is because it has a particular ratio of yes to no answers. And that ratio seems to kind of work itself out through all sorts of divination tools. It is roughly 50% positive, 25% neutral, and 25% negative. So signs point to yes is one of your positives. Ask again later is a neutral. And no, I think is actually one of them.
No is one of them.
Is clearly one of the negatives. So if you're really curious, the Wikipedia page on Magic 8-Balls will show you several different versions of yes, no, and maybe that you can kind of glance through and see how they sort of fall out. But that ratio seems to work very well. So take all those things, all those symbols that you sort of created, and go through them and tick them off. Is this a positive one, a neutral one, or a negative one? If you don't have enough negatives, or you don't have enough positives, or you have no neutrals, then you're probably a little out of balance. And you need to go back to the drawing board, look at these again, and reshuffle them, and maybe add a couple, maybe take a few off, and then run through it again. So And if you're looking for meanings, if you've run out of things to sort of put together as part of your divination set, find a rune or Omen cheat sheet that has kind of a quick message on what each of these things is. So, harvest or growth or things like that, strength, and kind of run down that list and say, oh, I need one for that. It's vaguely positive or it's vaguely negative. I'll find a symbol that matches that meaning to me. So you can also kind of reverse engineer it to get to where you need to be. And then, of course, the next part is to try and work out designs for all of these things. Because these are symbol sets, they're meant to speak to you more in symbol than in word, if you can manage that. And kind of start out on a set of index cards or something like that, to try and test them out. And once you've tested them out for a couple of weeks, you can do the symbol a day, you can meditate on these things. Where you find yourself lacking, go back to the drawing board and revise it again. Creating Omen sets is very much like poetry. Sometimes you gotta let it sit on a shelf and read through it and then revise it a little bit. And sometimes it's right the first time. It's hard to tell.
I think another thing, going back to like you were saying with the dragon, how sometimes you just need to look at what you're looking at harder. Instead of looking at the dragon, look at the dragon's eye for vision. Look at the dragon's breath. Look at the scales for protection. Break down what you're doing if you need to arrange those positives and negatives and neutrals.
And once you've spent some time going through all of these and testing them, give the set to someone else with your basic set of meanings. Not a whole lot of explanation, but just enough so they can get the gist of it. And ask them to test it out for a couple of weeks. See how they interact with it. Because what they're going to see are the things that you completely missed because you're too close to that set. Even if this isn't intended for anyone else's use but your own. This is an important step because divination is very much about vision. And when we sit too close to something, we get blinded by that closeness. So you need to let someone else take a look at it and sort of fiddle with it a bit. And then it's ready for prime time. So
it's called market research.
It is. It's called market research. It's something that we didn't do with the crane set that I kind of wish that we had done.
Sure.
We gave it to Jan first, and she messed around with it for a little bit. And she came back and she said, "You're missing at least 3 new symbols." And I said, "Great, give them to us." And she did.
Yeah.
We're still currently on version 1 of the design, but I wish that we'd done that first so that we could have run that first set of designs.
Well, again, we were too close to it.
Yeah. And there's a point where you just sort of need to settle on a finished state. Because, like anything else, poetry, artwork, all of it, if you're spending all of your time improving it, it's never ready for prime time. There's a point where you just have to say, all right, we're done, it's out the door, this is what we're doing. And because if you keep fiddling with it, what you lose is that objectivity that the lots give you. And that's what we're really aiming for here, is to have a set that is finished and done, at least for, the foreseeable future, that has that objectivity.
Let your children make the next set, when they move the ice in.
Yeah. Sets, symbol sets, like I said earlier, they are truly random if they are lots. You have no control over what you're pulling. And that's what makes them special. Unless, of course, you've got a chip in one of them, or you've got a very clearly different feeling thing. You want to have as much uniformity as you can. But they are as random as they can be. And the reason for that randomization and the reason for uniformity in symbol feel, if you've got them in a bag, for instance, is that you want the symbol set to be free of both prejudice and power. The idea that you can change the meaning based on reaching in and moving to a different lot because you know what that lot feels like. You want to be able to not do that because that's your prejudice. And the power over them is the ability to change the way that the reading will go based on how you feel the reading should go. So if you can tell that you've got Hogalaws in your hand and you don't want Hogalaws, then your set is flawed. You need to fix it and get something that is uniform for you.
I think as you use sets too, that's an important thing to note is that you might wear certain runes down.
Yep.
So it's important if you've been using that set for years, it's still important to do that rune of the day or whatever to get through the whole set, to use every set, to deepen that because even from an energy level to be.
Yeah, and runes and Ogham do have a lifespan. I mean, especially once you get to the point where you've used them so much that you have worn down your Hogalaws or your Fehu. Let's hope you don't wear down your Hogalaws through use. Some people might. Yeah, but make sure that you take an objective look at your symbol set as well. Know when it's time to get a new set. Sacrifice the old one to the fire. Make one or have one made. And you will find yourself a better seer because of it. So, any other questions or comments? That's most of what I have. Awesome. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.